Imagine a city of wooden temples and grass-covered pyramids, spread across the floodplain of a great river, home to as many as 20,000 people. Now imagine that this city stood not in Egypt or Mesopotamia, but in North America, just across the water from what is now St. Louis, Missouri. Around the year 1100, this was Cahokia, the largest city anywhere north of Mexico, larger at its peak than contemporary London or Paris. And almost no one has heard of it. At its center rose Monks Mound, a colossal earthen pyramid more than 30 meters tall, built in a series of broad terraces. Its base covered a larger area than the Great Pyramid of Giza. On its flattened summit once stood a great wooden building, probably the residence of the city's ruler, looking out over a planned landscape of more than 120 mounds. Below it stretched the Grand Plaza, an artificially leveled public space larger than 30 football fields, where thousands could gather for ceremonies and games. What makes Cahokia so staggering is that its builders had no metal tools, no wheels, and no draft animals. Every basket of earth, and the city required an estimated 15 million cubic feet of it, was dug, carried, and piled by human hands. This was a society capable of organizing enormous numbers of people toward a shared vision, a civilization with social hierarchy, astronomy, long-distance trade, and monumental architecture. And yet its people left no written records that we can read, no name we know them by. We call them the Mississippians, after the river and the culture they spread. But who they truly were, how they ruled this metropolis, and why they ultimately abandoned it, these are questions that still haunt the quiet green mounds today. Cahokia did not grow slowly over many centuries. It seems to have exploded into being. Around the year 1050, archaeologists see what they call a Big Bang, a sudden, dramatic reorganization of the landscape, as if a new idea or a new leadership swept across the region and gathered people together on a scale never seen before in North America. Older scattered villages were replaced almost overnight by a planned urban center. The population may have surged into the tens of thousands within a generation. What drew them? Part of the answer lies in the land itself. Cahokia sat in a fertile zone known as the American Bottom, rich floodplain soil perfect for growing maize, which had become the staple crop of the region. Surplus corn could feed a concentrated population and free people for other work, building mounds, crafting goods, performing rituals. But food alone does not explain Cahokia. The city became a religious and political magnet, the center of a worldview that radiated outward across much of the present-day United States. Archaeologists have found goods at Cahokia that came from astonishing distances: copper from the Great Lakes, seashells from the Gulf of Mexico, mica from the Appalachian Mountains. Distinctive Cahokian pottery, symbols, and religious motifs spread along the river networks for hundreds of miles. People may have traveled from far away to witness its ceremonies and then carried its ideas home. For perhaps 2 centuries, Cahokia was the beating heart of an entire cultural world, a place of pilgrimage, power, and spectacle. To stand in its grand plaza during a festival, surrounded by thousands of people and overlooked by a temple on an artificial mountain, must have felt like standing at the center of the universe. The people of Cahokia were watching the sky. On the western edge of the city, archaeologists uncovered the remains of a remarkable structure, a great circle of massive wooden posts, dozens of them, set carefully into the ground. They nicknamed it Woodhenge, after the famous stone circle in England. This was not decoration. It was an instrument. Standing at the center of the circle on the right morning, an observer would see the sun rise in precise alignment with a specific post on the horizon, marking the spring and autumn equinoxes and the summer and winter solstices. It was a solar calendar, built of timber, that let Cahokia's priests track the turning of the year, time their ceremonies, and perhaps schedule the planting and harvest that sustained the city. But Cahokia's spiritual life had a far darker side, and it was uncovered in one of the mounds known today as Mound 72. There, archaeologists found a series of burials that revealed something chilling about how power worked in this society. At the center lay a high-status individual, laid on a bed of more than 20,000 shell beads arranged in the shape of a bird, a powerful religious symbol. Around and near him were the bodies of others, including mass graves containing the remains of dozens of young women, all roughly the same age, who appear to have been killed in a single event. Other pits held the bodies of people who had been executed, some apparently buried before they were fully dead. This was human sacrifice, carried out as part of public ritual and the politics of the elite. Cahokia, for all its astronomical sophistication and monumental beauty, was also a place where life and death were instruments of power, and where the gods, it seems, demanded blood. Then, sometime in the 1100s, something began to change at Cahokia, and the change was not for the better. One of the clearest signs is defensive. The people built a massive wooden stockade, a palisade nearly 3 kilometers long, with watchtowers and bastions, encircling the central precinct of the city in Monks Mound. Building it consumed an estimated 20,000 logs, and they rebuilt it several times over the following generations. You do not invest that kind of labor in a wall unless you are afraid of something. Whether the threat came from outsiders or from conflict within Cahokia's own crowded society, the city was no longer the open, confident place it had once been. Other troubles were mounting. Concentrating thousands of people in one place put enormous pressure on the surrounding environment. The endless demand for firewood and building timber may have stripped the nearby hills of trees, and deforestation can worsen flooding and erosion. Recent studies of the floodplain suggest that the Mississippi and its tributaries became increasingly unpredictable, with damaging floods striking the very farmland the city depended on. There are also signs of a shifting climate, with droughts that would have cut into the maize harvest that fed the population. Crowding, sanitation, disease, political strain, environmental damage, and a less forgiving climate, these pressures fed on one another. The archaeological record shows the city beginning to contract. Neighborhoods were abandoned. The grand building projects slowed and then stopped. The pilgrims and the spectacle faded. Cahokia had risen with astonishing speed, and now, just as it had bound tens of thousands of people together around a shared belief, that binding force was starting to come undone. By around the year 1350, Cahokia was empty. The greatest city north of Mexico, a metropolis that had stood for 3 centuries, was simply abandoned. Its people did not vanish from the earth, they dispersed, scattering into smaller communities across the river valleys and grasslands, their descendants among the many native nations of the American Midwest and South. But the city itself, with its plazas and pyramids and its calendar of giant posts, was left to the grass and the rain. There was no single catastrophe we can point to, no great fire or recorded conquest. Instead, the collapse seems to have been the sum of many pressures: environmental strain, flooding, political conflict, and perhaps a loss of faith in the leaders and the beliefs that had held everything together. When the shared vision that built Cahokia finally failed, there was no longer any reason to stay. By the time French explorers arrived in the region in the late 1600s, the mounds were ancient and silent, and the local people they met had no memory of who had built them. The newcomers wrongly assumed the great earthworks must be natural hills, or the work of some lost vanished race, anything but the ancestors of the Native Americans they saw before them. For centuries that prejudice helped erase Cahokia from the story of the continent. Even today, with parts of the site protected as a World Heritage Landmark, much of ancient Cahokia lies buried beneath modern suburbs and highways, its mounds bulldozed or forgotten. Stand atop Monks Mound now, and you can see the skyline of St. Louis in the distance. Beneath your feet are the remains of a city that thrived and fell long before that skyline existed, a reminder that North America had great cities of its own, and that we are only beginning to remember them.